Hello. Today is July 15th, 2011. We're meeting today with Mr. Bob Brunson at his home in Estes Park, Colorado. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer for the Northern Colorado Veterans History Project. Welcome, Bob, and thanks for sitting down today to tell your story.
Well, thank you for the interview.
Very good. Let's start out, if we could. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your date of birth, where you were born, a little bit about your family.
Well, I was born just outside of Abilene, Kansas. My folks were on a homesteaded farm. My father was a farmer at that time, and that's where I was born. I don't remember the incident, but then my father took a job with the state of Kansas as a Farm Bureau agent in western Kansas. And that's basically my first memories are in there. And where I went to school up to the middle of the third grade.
What was your date of birth?
I was born June 2nd, 1921.
Okay.
And so a few memories go back to St. Francis, Kansas, but most of them were in Leavenworth, Kansas, where I grew up and graduated from high school. Went to Kansas State Agricultural College, as it was known as in those days.
So
Kansas State College.
So you guys went out to western Kansas, St. Francis area till third grade, and then moved back to Leavenworth. Is that?
Well, from the farm near Abilene, they moved to western Kansas, and then two of my siblings were born in St. Francis. My younger siblings, and then moved to Leavenworth, and where my father was in the insurance business.
And speaking of siblings, how many brothers and sisters?
I've got an older sister and a younger brother, and a sister was the baby of the family.
Okay.
So,
Well, before we move ahead with your story, a couple historical incidences that I like to ask you guys about during this time is, do you have much memory, and was your family affected much by the Great Depression? And also, I don't know if by this time if you were had moved back to eastern Kansas, but do you have much memory of the Dust Bowl?
we only fringed on the Dust Bowl. It didn't get that far east, really. But we did get high winds and dusts and grasshoppers. Grasshoppers were a plague then, and I can remember mixing some kind of poison with corn and scattering it around, or corn flakes type of thing, and scattering it around the outside of our alfalfa or soybean field. And but you know, as kids you acclimate yourself to the surroundings and the way you're brought up. And my folks, my dad had taken a sales job with the insurance company right about the time the Depression hit, and we didn't realize really the extent of the problems our parents had. They just plugged away, and we lived on a little farmette of about 10 acres on the edge of town, and for a long time we didn't have a car. We walked 2 miles to school, to high school. Grade school was about a mile. Church was 2 miles. So 6 of the 7 days, at least, we walked sometimes 4 or 5 miles a day. Sometimes we'd go in and out twice, Boy Scout meetings and so forth. And I know my parents were struggling, but yet we knew people that were a lot worse than we were.
Mhm.
And so anyway, I graduated in 39 and 1939. Went to Kansas State studying agriculture. I was thinking of getting into the dairy industry because we had a small dairy. We had 4 cows, and it was, I guess, the place of most confidence that I had in proceeding on with life.
Mhm.
And while there, well, I might mention that when I was probably 5 or 6, I was aware that my father was in the Army Signal Corps as a pilot flying Jennies. He was going through the course when he and my mom were married. And so I had a latent interest in aviation for a long, long time. Built models and that kind of thing.
Had you ever gotten a chance to go up?
I've never been. I remember one time in St. Francis that somebody flying a Jenny had landed outside of town. And my dad took me, and we went out and talked to the pilot and so forth. We never got a flight in it, but I remember Dad was talking about his experiences, which was probably less than 10 years prior, that he had flown that airplane.
Now, did he go overseas or?
No, they must have found out he had gotten his wings because they signed the armistice, and he never got over there. So, but my interest, I think, goes way back then.
I'll be darned.
And but as an ag student in Kansas State, I learned of a civilian pilot training that they call CPT training, available to college students, free of cost. And as an ag student, I didn't have as good a chance in getting into that program as an engineering student. So I switched to the engineering school and applied for it and got in the program. So I had soloed probably October or so, still in the course when the war seemed to be imminent, and I was interested in further flying, so I asked my parents for permission to join the Air Force. And I did, got a physical, but I had that morning, just to be to know that everything was going to be best, I borrowed my roommate's electric razor, which I'd never before used, and it seemed to draw up a bunch of welts on my face, tender skin. And so I had a bit of a rash. And they said, well, you've passed a physical, but when this rash clears up, come on back and we'll go through. Well, it was almost the next weekend, walking to the Sunday morning, walking to the boarding house for breakfast, learned of Pearl Harbor.
Oh boy.
And so as soon as I could find the time, I went back to Fort Riley, where I had taken my physical before, and said, let's get on with this physical. They couldn't find it anyplace. So that was a big disappointment. And but then they dropped their requirements. You didn't have to have 2 years of college, which was a requirement for Navy and Army, Air Force. It was a part of the Signal Corps at one time, and used for observation of artillery fire. But anyway, I decided I'd try for the Navy. I figured they they gave a better training, and if I could get in there, if I didn't, I'd come back to the Army. So I got into the Navy program, and was very happy that I did.
Now, how soon after all this happened did you ship off then for?
Oh, I started my training on, I think, May 7th of 42. I graduated from flight school on, I think, late December, December 23rd or something, in 42. And then I applied for fighters, and you had to make a choice in there where you wanted to go, multi-engine or carrier types, and I enjoyed the maneuverability of the airplane rather than just to get from here to there. So I applied for fighters, and I got into that program. Then after graduation, we went to what they called a pre-operational training program, which flew my first fighter, which was a Brewster Buffalo, an F-2A that did not prove very successful against the Japanese. And so it was on to training, but it's the first time they point to the airplane, give you the handbook to read, and you can talk to somebody that's flown it before, but then go in and fly it. So, you know, it kind of an exciting time, just anticipating what might be and what might not, and so forth. So that went well. In that advanced training, they had an instrument flying course, an additional one, that got into a power spiral, so to speak, which is different than a spin. In a spin, you've got a stalled wing, and you're turning around that stalled wing. In a power spiral, you're just in a tight turn, heading for the ground. And I had received that recovery from one of those in the additional flight training. And one night we were doing cross countries out of Miami, Florida, over the Okeechobee, I think, swamps. And there's no lights on the bottom there, and it was an overcast, so we were almost in a blackout. And the pilot, I was riding the back seat. The pilot up front didn't realize it, but he was in a power spiral. And through the intercom, I told him, made him aware of, and nothing happened, and I decided I better take charge. So I did. I pulled us out of that, and later, after we got back, by the way, 3 planes went into the swamp that night.
Wow.
So it wasn't, but he said, well, I'm glad you did that. I didn't know what we were in. And he evidently hadn't been exposed to it in the training. So I felt very confident. I felt much more confident on believing the instruments. Vertigo is a hard thing to explain, but your instruments tell you one thing, but your feelings tell you another.
Mm.
And the tendency is to rely on your feelings, but that training and the subsequent saving of my own life as well as the pilot's, I figured, gave me a lot of confidence in instrument flying.
Mm.
So later on, a month or so later, when we were into advanced training, getting ready to join a fighter squadron, a fellow Lieutenant Commander Whithelm came down to the training base and was asking for volunteers to fly night fighters, to join a night fighter squadron. And one of the incentives that we would be flying Corsairs, which was the hottest thing off of the production line, and very early models of it. But it was the fastest plane in the air, according to the specs, and a graceful looking airplane. So it was an incentive, and then the confidence of the instruments and kind of enjoying instrument flying. I volunteered for it and was accepted into the program.
And this was the first night fighter
This
squad.
was the first that they had. They'd been thinking about it, and they had land-based night fighters, but nothing carrier-based. And the Japs were starting to harass the fleet at night, and they needed some protection.
Yeah, okay.
So they started our program. It's my thinking that they chose the Corsair for the initial night fighter because of its speed and maneuverability in the air, but they didn't realize that it wasn't as suitable for carriers landings as one of the other airplanes coming off the production line, the Hellcat, the F-6F. So they manufactured, I think, 32 of those of the Corsair, and enough for a Marine squadron and a Navy squadron. And after a Navy squadron, a day fighter squadron, didn't seem to, that flying Corsairs, that carriers really weren't for them, and they were land-based, we figured that we would be land-based. But some events in the South Pacific took place, and they realized the necessity of shipboard night fighters, so they told our squadron we're going aboard ship.
Wow.
Regardless of the airplanes we were flying, which we did. So we figured we attained 2 firsts. One flying Corsairs aboard, being the first squadron to operate off of a carrier, day or night, and we were doing it at night, and the other being the first night fighters. And so, but
Can you talk a little bit about? I mean, it's a whole different, in my understanding, a whole different ball game with the carrier landings. And you talk a little bit about landing and taking off on a carrier. It's
prior to, well, after our graduation, when we knew we were going into carrier types, with every training program, there was a portion of it where we practiced following a signal officer's arms to land on a field, which was a little different approach than we would normally do from 500 feet, making a declining turn into to the runway. On carrier landings, we're maybe 50 feet off the ground until you pick up the signal officer's signals and respond to them at 40 feet off the ground. Or at, there was quite a few sessions of practicing with the signal officer on land, field carrier landing practice. Then the signal officer has directed pilots to land aboard a carrier with probably 50 or 100 times more than we individuals would land that type of plane on a carrier. So we had lots of confidence in him bringing us into a position behind the deck of the carrier to where he would signal us to cut our engines and then glide for the deck. The initial landings on a carrier were kind of interesting because never before was the landing field moving.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah.
And you see a spot that you'd normally think of on the runway, and as what you move in on, and then compare it with another spot when you're boarding a ship and it's moving away from you. So, but not that fast. And of course then you also catch a wire, which brings you to somewhat of abrupt halt. And so it was an interesting experience, and I think it helped refine your touch to of the airplane to what you wanted it to do.
So was it an fairly easy transition for you to go from land-based to carrier?
Yeah.
Or was it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wasn't bad.
Okay.
And then later on at night was you don't see the runway as much. Well, we practiced on the ground before with a signal officer before we went aboard ship, but the ship was not lit up at all,
Right.
except for you might say runway lights, the lights along both sides of the deck that only appeared from the approaching end. They were kind of shielded over, and but the signal officer used neon wands to give us our position. And so other than that, it was about the same. And used to night flying, it wasn't, I'm not recalling that it was a major transition. The day fighter and day carrier operations were not trained in night flying, and usually were back on deck before nightfall. There were occasions after a strike, one in particular in the Marianas Turkey Shoot, where their distance was further really than their gas supply, and are very close. And those guys came back after dark, never have made a blackout landing, so to speak, and I'm sure made them quite nervous. The finding the ship or locating the ship, if you're in the area at night, is really no problem, because the wake of the ship, the churning of the propellers, makes a phosphorescent tail behind the ship. So in a fleet, which we had 2 big carriers and 2 small carriers, some destroyers, and some maybe some cruisers, you knew the position of your particular ship within that just by the location of the phosphorescent wakes. And so you'd make a pass on it, and the normal procedure from daytime, only you just did it at night. And so...
Well, take your story now. You're sent out to sea. What carrier were you based on? And take your story from there, once you got landed or based on a carrier.
Well, our squadron was split several times. The first split was to take the 6 senior officers, our commanding officer, and the 6 senior ones, with one exception, and they were stationed on Guadalcanal as a land-based unit. When Butch O'Hare, a Navy hero that I won't get into here, but he was killed in trying to intercept at night, and they decided that they really had to have night fighters, so they told our squadron to ship out and join the fleet. Then they split that squadron into 2 parts to go aboard 2 different carriers in 2 different fleets. So we ended up with, starting out, we had 7 pilots aboard the Enterprise in the contingent that I was in. I'll go back just a little bit. After the first group left for Guadalcanal, the 2nd senior officer, which was Dick Harmer, nickname of Chick Harmer, had to train 13 ensigns and finishing their night fighter training. It was about 4 months later that we were sent out to the fleet, and then that was split into 2 groups, the Enterprise and the Intrepid. The Intrepid got hit by a torpedo, and in February of 44, and limped back to Pearl, and they kept the pilots, the night fighter pilots, stationed there for training pilots coming through. So we were the only Corsairs in the whole fleet, actually. There at a maximum of 4. Most of the time we only had 3. But day fighters would fly in groups of 4, or basically have a team of 2 to help protect each other. Night fighters was a solo type
Really?
of operation. A wingman wouldn't do us any good. We were under the direction of a fighter control officer that was on the deck of the carrier, using radar, would direct us orally over the radio into the tail of onto the tail of the enemy, or the Japanese. And that was the tactic that was being used. So, and we there was another carrier, another large carrier, that eventually, or about a month or so later, received a night fighter squadron, or parts of a night fighter squadron, flying Hellcats. And but we were still the only Corsair squadron.
What was life like at sea? I mean, here's this Kansas flatland farm boy out to sea. What was life like for you on the ship, and did you get your sea legs, or how would?
Well, I never had a problem with air sickness or motion sickness that I am aware of. So going aboard ship was just somewhat of an interesting change. I didn't have a problem with it. And as a flying officer, or as an officer in the Navy, aboard ship, we were treated very well. We had officers' mess hall, and waiters serving us, and we had clean sheets. And well, I think the enlisted did that, but they didn't have the accommodations of a cabin. Now 4 of us shared a cabin, but of course the ship's crew and the squadron's enlisted people lived on bunks that were stacked 4 or 5 high, and in rows, so flying off a carrier, we saw the clean side of the war.
Sure. Yeah.
The ones that really had the dirty work were the ground troops. And there's the guys that need the credit.
Yeah. So I assume, though, that you guys slept during the day and worked at night. You were kind of reverse of everybody else.
We were on duty at night, and we shared primary duty. When the Hellcats came in, we split primary duty between ships, and then even among our squadron. So it was kind of the luck of the draw, you might say, or the unluck of the draw. But I think the majority of us enjoyed our night flying, or we felt comfortable with it. I know we had one fellow in our squadron that never felt really secure, and we ended up aboard the Enterprise, just 4 pilots and 3 planes. We had wrecked a few in landings and so forth. And they were replaced, but we never had really more than 3 in flying shape. But as we flew individually, that as long as we get a plane in the air, that was we didn't need numbers.
So your job primarily, was it more of a defensive sort of thing, going up and protecting the fleet, or
Yes.
and was it a nightly thing, or just as on call as enemy approached, or?
In fact, it was quite controversial for a while, because if they launched a night fighter, say they were in enemy territory, which is where they had mostly be picked up by the enemy. The deck crews would be arranging the planes on the deck for a takeoff launch, either pre-dawn or early morning, to go in to strike the island that we were moving in on. And and during the day, this would be sequenced until various times, sometimes 2 and 3 flights, would the squadrons would leave. And so you need a runway, basically, for takeoff. You can launch some with catapults, but so planes were arranged at the back end of the ship, the after end, and but for landing, they had to have that area clear, so excess planes were spotted at the forward part of the carrier deck. So this means that the crews were constantly moving airplanes through the day, and then at night, if they would launched a night fighter, they would have to move all those planes forward to be able to bring them aboard again at night. So the admirals or the commanding officers were very reluctant to use the night fighters, and occasionally one would get off. And we had very rudimentary radar. Sometimes it was working, sometimes it wasn't. But the skipper got the first kill, so to speak, at night, and then one fellow that was his wingman most of the time. Usually they shot us off the catapult, and they would shoot 2 in the air at a time just for backup, but they weren't operating together. One would be circling someplace, or maybe be circling someplace ready to use. But the skipper got the first one, and his wingman got one right over the fleet, where you could hear the plane flying over, and you could see the tracers go out, and then a plane explode. So it was kind of a selling point that visually to a lot of people that they could do it. And but it was still reluctant to use us. Only at the last minute, and if they, in shooting us off at the last minute, the plane was over us. Yeah. It was too late to try to make an interception. So that was kind of the problems of initiating that, but it did lead to making a night carrier, a carrier that only operated at night, and it had bombers and fighters on it.
This was later on?
It was within 6 months after we got back.
Oh.
They had a night carrier. In fact, the Enterprise, which we were on, was the one designated as the first night carrier. And of course, back then there were straight deck carriers. Now they've kind of alleviated a lot of that parking by having a landing deck and a taking off deck there.
Mm-hmm.
We call them a canted deck. And that the squadrons now are all weather, day, night, and of course jets, which is a different operation.
Yeah. Well, you had mentioned earlier that the radar was pretty rudimentary. Have you ever as you look back now in your flying days then, what about the instruments? As you look back now, obviously in comparison to today's technology, they're very rudimentary, but were they satisfactory as you look back now on what you were doing, or do you look back and say, boy, I'm amazed we were flying with this equipment?
Yeah. Well, there are two instruments that are very basic, and I think they had a rate of climb indicator in the early days, and they also had a ball, or they had kind of like the bubble on a level, and you can see it on some of the old instrument panels. It's a little tube that's curved. The ends are down, the middle is up, and you'd have that little air bubble that would tell you whether you were level or not. They subsequently developed a needle, so to speak, that would tell whether you're turning or not. And that they, instead of having the air bubble, they put a little marble, you might say, and inverted the tube, and they had a needle sticking up in that same instrument that would tell you whether you're turning or not, and we called it the needle ball. And the other instrument was the airspeed, and you can fly safely by using the needle ball and the airspeed. You can keep it straight and level, and you can go for altitude, but that doesn't tell you what's ahead of you or anything of that sort. Then they developed gyroscopic instruments, which you might say is a replica of a gyroscope that would stay basic to the horizon or gravity, and they could put screens in front of it so it would portray to you where the horizon was, and more of a visual, and you could tell whether you're turning or you're going up and down, and those were gyroscopic instruments, which was a big improvement. And of course now they can almost duplicate the ground with needle ball airspeed. I mean with GPS system. So, but we were early in that transition.
And pretty reliable equipment. I mean, you were relying entirely on that.
But you had to believe it. If one would get, say, in a spiral, or a turn for a little bit, there are follicles in his earlobe, ear canals, that are in a fluid, and that fluid moves like a level, you might say, a bubble in a level. And it moves those hair follicles, which gives you a sense of balance. And if you close your eyes, it's like the pin the tail on the donkey type of thing. And if they turn you around enough, you didn't know where your balance was. Same thing in an airplane. And you might think, well, if you're in a turn and you stop the turn, that your ears still make you feel like you're in that turn. And if you believe your feelings, you'll go back into the turn. If you believe your instruments, then you will stop that turn. And pilots eventually get to where they don't believe those feelings, so it's not a problem.
Wow.
And that's where we were with night fighters. We had confidence in the instrument panel, and it wouldn't be a problem to them. Where others that are not used to it really have to talk themselves into it a lot of the time, into the discipline. Don't believe it. Don't believe the way you feel.
Wow.
So.
Can you talk about some of the, I know you guys weren't used as often as you'd like to, but can you talk about some of the sorties you went up on? Was there any that stood out?
Well,
Or?
the closest I came to be a Navy hero was being shot off one night. We had checked the radar before launching, and it was working. I was shot off the catapult and tried to turn the radar gear on, and it wouldn't work. There was a switch behind the seat on some of the radar gear that would switch it from a ground battery to the airplane battery. It wasn't very convenient, but the ground crews could test it and then flip it back on so it'd work in the airplane. Well, my first thought was that maybe they didn't flip that switch, because I couldn't get it to work. And so I trimmed up the airplane, got out of my seat and turned around and to where I could reach behind the seat and flip that switch. And it still didn't make a difference. So I flipped it back. And it still didn't work. But it was a nice, bright, moonlit night, and the fighter director had picked up a bogey and up about 10,000 feet and vectored me on it. And I eventually spotted it on a visual, and realized I didn't have my guns charged. So I reached over to charge the guns, and the guy must have seen me and he pulled over. I was flying up a moon streak. So I don't know whether I'm the fortunate one or he is, but we're both alive. He must have had a tail gunner that spotted me, and he peeled off. But if the tail gunner opened up on me, I'd have been, and he had any accuracy, I would have been a dead duck. But so neither one of us. But had I done it, had my guns charged and just sweep that area, and it would have been a first on a non-radar but visual
Oh, wow.
Contact. So That was the closest that I came.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Our launching was kind of the luck of the draw. Whoever had to schedule a certain night uh, was launched. Sometimes we sat in the airplane for an hour or so and then said, go back to the ready room.
Mm.
And sometimes we were launched, but we're in a position to be catapulted a lot of evenings. So. But in the ready room, we shared a few of the back seats of the day fighters' ready room that they allotted to us, and we had bunks in there. Either they had red lights on within the ready room, or we wore red goggles to dilate our eyes so that we would be more adapted once we
Wow.
left the ready room.
Wow.
And so
Well, in the world of aviation, they say that any landing you can walk away is a good landing. You had some pretty close calls with. Didn't you have a carrier crash? Can you talk a little bit about that?
yes, one night, 3 of us were launched as kind of a practice run for us. And it was a cold, black night. But anyway, we did some maneuvers and in coming into landing, in being shot off the catapult, I think it was my starboard wing light went out. And the signal officer can't see the airplane a lot of the time. He can see the lights though, and he knows from experience the position of those lights where they need to be
Okay.
to bring you over the deck. But with one of the wingtip lights missing, he doesn't really have a reference. And so I was trying to make my approaches and got waved off a number of times. Finally got a cut, and and you're following him rather than looking at the deck or anything ahead.
Mm.
And but as soon as he gives you the cut sign, you're looking for the landing spot. And I was way off, and I kind of flew into the island.
Oh, jeez.
And or the wing caught the island and ripped it off, and momentum was cartwheeling me up the deck, and I was just praying, don't go off the side.
Right. Yeah.
And it didn't, and but it was totally demolished, and I wasn't hurt a bit.
Is that right? Huh.
I think I had a cut a half-inch long just on the surface of my arm or something like that.
Wow. Wow.
So, and a carrier is a place to have a crash landing, because it's moving through the water at about 20 knots, and hopefully there's a wind out there, and maybe 10 or 15 knots. So that knocks about 45 knots off your flying speed relative to the landing platform. So, and then they have the crash crews. They've got guys with asbestos suits in case of fire. They've got first aid doctors and everything. They've got a crane that they can lift up if you're upside down and so forth. So a little different than on land. I had a Corsair, later when I was flying in the reserve that the engine ran out of oil on takeoff, and in trying to find a spot to land, I didn't have much choice but to I turned back to the field hoping I could make it, but I could see that I couldn't. So I was landing with the airplane speed and a tailwind of a pretty severe tailwind. So, and I smeared that Corsair over a countryside and walked away from it.
Wow.
So, been fortunate.
Was it hard to get back on the horse after these accidents? I mean, was there any?
I didn't feel as comfortable. A little engine rumble, and I was sitting on the side of me, kind of wondering, am I having engine trouble again? So, but no, I was quite fortunate in my flying days.
Yeah, yeah. Was it? Did you ever get a chance to fly a Hellcat, or were you glad that you were in the Corsair?
Well, after I came back from overseas, I was assigned night fighter instructor duty, which they were using Hellcats and as a trainer plane using Beechcraft, SNBs, the Navy called them, twin engine, a cabin, and we'd take up several students at a time and let them practice interceptions. Then the commanding officer that I had aboard ship, Chick Harmer, was the flight training officer at a naval station in Vero Beach, Florida, night fighter training, and invited me to come down and being his flight test officer, which checks out airplanes that have been, complaints have been filed on. They go through the ground crews before they put them back on the line to be flown again. They have them test flown, and that was my job, and I had a crew to do it to help me with that. And at that air base, we had a number of different types of airplane. We had dive bombers, we had torpedo bombers, we had fighters. The Marines had F-7Fs, which was a twin engine Grumman night fighter, and they also had some Black Widows, which were the Army night fighter, land-based, that they had used in training. We had some support planes. We had a little Grumman amphibian that learned to do water landings in. And we had a couple of Stearmans, which were a basic training. At one time, they rigged up one of the Stearmans and one of the torpedo bombers with spray facilities or equipment so that we could spray mosquitoes. So we had those, and it was my duty to make sure that if they had been complained about, that their complaints were okay.
Wow, wow.
And
So then, how long were you overseas? So you were overseas at sea, and then
later on,
sent to training school.
it was only overseas about 7 months.
Okay.
Not quite 7. We came back in July '44.
Oh, okay. So the war was still going on then
The
overseas.
war
Oh,
was
okay.
still
Okay.
going on, and I think they realized that the equipment we were flying was really not the safest. They kept the Hellcats over there, and eventually they moved. There was a Marine squadron that went over land-based about the same time, flying the same type of airplanes, and they moved them up to Tinian. At first they were down around Guadalcanal, where the first portion of our squadron was originally signed. So we were really the only Corsair squadron. Toward the end of the war, they had developed it for day fighters, and mainly during the Korean War. It was used both as a night fighter and as a day fighter, and off of carriers. They, while we were out there with the fleet, they did make some major improvements on the shock absorbers on the main landing gear, and raised the tail wheel so that the plane was actually a little more level sitting on the ground. But in refining the shock absorbers, it made the plane a better plane to land. It had a tendency to stall on the starboard wing, I think it was, at low speeds. So if you got too slow after your cut, your wing might drop, and that wheel would hit first, it would bounce up, and you'd hit the other wheel, and then your tail wheel would hit, and you just was bouncing all over the place. But lots of improvements were made, and it was a very successful airplane for the Navy.
So then you finished out then the war in a training capacity then?
Yes.
Down in Florida? You were down in Florida?
Then briefly I was the engineering officer at Cecil Field for 3 months, I think it was, something of that sort, before my discharge was effective, and then went back to school.
Back to K-State?
Kansas State school, and stayed in the reserve, and it was in the reserve that I had to land another Corsair in a plowed field. And
wow.
so,
and did you get your degree then in engineering, or go back to agriculture,
yes.
or how did you?
No, I got it in engineering, but when I graduated, aeronautics was kind of in a decline, and I took a job in the grain manufacturing, grain equipment manufacturing industry, and did that for 15 years, and was in a lot to material handling of granular type of material, and then also construction of slip form construction, which isn't used much anymore, but a means of building forms on the ground and moving them up, like the process used to build a lot of the grain elevator,
okay.
the grain storage facilities that you see around the country. So,
and that's the career you went on to have then, in
for
primarily
a
in that
number of years, and then the government quit financing rural elevators and terminals, so that kind of died away. I ended up coming to a construction company in Colorado here that was into material handling of coal or phosphates, using the type of equipment that I was used to. So I was in their design here, and was overseas on a couple of projects. One with Stearns Roger in a facility in Israel
Oh, wow.
in 75 and 6. And then they were in a decline when that project got to a point where I wasn't needed on it. And I was about to be turned loose and had an opportunity with Brown and Root in Algeria.
Wow.
So I worked in Algeria for 2.5 years.
Wow.
So, and had some opportunities to travel from there.
I'll be darned. Now, during your time overseas, did you ever have any chance to go land-based or explore any of the islands? Were you carrier based the whole time? Or did you ever get off the ship?
No, well, we were, the fleet had an anchorage of the atoll of Majuro in the Marshall Islands that was taken over by our forces just about the time we joined it. It was a large atoll, I think 20-some miles across, and it had an opening in it that would allow vessels to come in, and so they could fortify, I suppose with nets or submarines or something, that entry. But it gave them, gave us an opportunity to refuel and resupply without going back to Pearl Harbor. And that would save several days each way. And that was used until they could move on and get closer to Japan, as history is noted. So we did, when the fleet was at anchor, we would go ashore and practice. We'd fly at night offshore. So we would keep up our proficiency of intercepts on one another out of the island of Majuro.
Okay. Now, through the years after you got out of the military and out of the reserves, did you maintain a private pilot's license? Or
I did a little private flying for companies I worked for, but then when I at one time that seemed to diminish. I didn't do much flying, and in coming out to Denver, I didn't do much until I shared an office with a fellow that was a graduate of the Air Force Academy. And he was a flight instructor and had access to airplanes, and he'd take me up once in a while, and I'd go shoot landings, and I kept up my license and physical. The license really is good for life, but it has to be backed up by a current physical, and anybody that will rent you an airplane wants to make sure you know how to fly that particular flight. So it's not just going out and flying. But in about 7 or 8 years ago, a ski group that I was in had a retired Navy fighter pilot that I got introduced to, and he had his own home-built aircraft, and invited me to go flying with him. Well, I've learned that these aircraft are very sturdy. They're aerobatically, they're designed and built to aerobatic stress specifications. So when we first time up, we had some friends that to fly formation on, and tested me out on formation flying. And then we broke away from then and did some aerobatics and loops and rolls and which was great. But I find I can't pull the G's on loops anymore without affecting my back. So don't do those, but get up and do some rolls once in a while with him.
No, we need to remind the audience that'll watch this tape that you're doing this in your 80s. You were doing this in your 80s.
In my 80s, yeah.
Well,
So it's been a rejuvenation. Well, actually, it goes back a little further than that. About 15 or so years ago, I was in the Tattered Cover bookstore in Denver in the history section, and I was waiting to meet somebody, and then here's military history and Navy history, and then here's a book on the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And well, I was there. So started thumbing through the book, and it's got the picture of our squadron in there. So that was interesting, and so I bought several of those books and wrote the author, and who's published a number of publications on Navy aircraft types. And so that picture has appeared in several different magazines. Wow. And books. Huh. A friend up here in Estes brought a naval history magazine to me at Rotary Club one day and said, "You'd be interested in this." And here was an article on our squadron.
Really?
And the squadron that was aboard the Intrepid that went back to Pearl, on what happened to them. Things that I'm unaware of. But as a result of that, it started perking my interest, and I felt my kids, my family really didn't know much about that part of my life. So I started collecting pictures of airplanes that I'd flown. And the computer was coming on about that time, and so I put them on the computer. And then I was watching a program of somebody put together on PowerPoint program, and I thought, gee, I ought to mess around with that, which I did, and started making a DVD or a CD of pictures, and then trying to put my history down in somewhat that order. But then I also met Rod Cobber, and who got me into flying again with him and with his friends. And I've flown various places with him, and of course we're going to Oshkosh at the end of this month, and then down to Reno to the Tailhook Association annual meeting. And I'm suspicious at this point. 2 days ago, I got a check from the Tailhook Society, which I had submitted an article to last January. And they said, well, we might use it. But I never heard from them. They have their summer issue coming out here in July, and I received this check for $300. I'm thinking that's telling me that they have accepted my article and have printed it.
I'll be
I
done.
didn't think there'd be any remuneration on it, but it'll be interesting to see
Yeah.
if that is printed.
Yeah.
No.
Well, speaking of your squad and such, through the years, did you guys keep in touch? Was there any sort of reunions or anything along those lines?
We never did, and when the computer, when my grandkids were learning the computer and all these games, before I had one and would be visiting my kids, they would have a computer, and I'd be left alone sometimes during the day, and they checked me out on it, and curiosity, and found that you could look up people. And so I thought, who could I look up? So I started looking up squadron members, and I found my skipper in Bellingham, Washington. Found him a different way though, but I found his wingman, who actually was living within 50 miles of the skipper, and he didn't know it.
Oh, we darn.
So I got them together before he died. I wish I'd really gone out and visited him. I didn't realize that I'd lose him that quick. But then I found another fellow that had I got a reply from his widow that he had died about 10 years earlier. My wingman, I call it a wingman, we really, when we were launched in pairs, and that sometimes if we were up in the daytime, we were paired off that way. But his name was Robert George Purrier, and we were on the island of Majuro one time. We just, the fleet had just pulled in, and we went ashore. The weather was kind of lousy, and we didn't want to fly that night. So we talked about going to a movie or something. And Bob said, it's my birthday. And I said, it's mine too. We were born the same day. But then in trying to find him, I knew he was from Lexington, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston. And I knew his birthday, and I thought I could find him. Poirier, I thought, wasn't a common name. Well, I found out it was. There were 140 some Robert Poiriers. And I tried writing to a number of them, and without any luck, and gave up. And then my son and I visited the Pensacola Museum several years ago, and Dave said, I've got another search engine. Let's try, what was your friend's name in the Navy? And it pulls up, and guys, 80, it had the ages there, and it had 86 or 87, and I said, I bet you that's him. And then it had relatives, and it had Montine, and that was his wife's name, and that's too unusual.
Yeah, right.
So I tried several, I think they give you a telephone number at that time, and I tried several calls and wasn't getting an answer, just an answering machine. Well, and then I left a message, but then I wrote and didn't get any answer. And a month or so later, I wrote and put a return envelope in there, and he replied with that one. And then he told me to when the answering machine came on, tell me who it was and wait a little bit. It takes him time to get to the telephone. So we've communicated, but he has a speech problem. He had gotten about 10 years prior playing tennis on a heat stroke. So, and it's gotten where I can't understand him. I kind of communicate through his daughter, and I don't get a response from him, but he's out there. So, and if it is published, I'll have to send him a copy of the tailhook.
Yeah.
I'll have to get several copies, I know,
Yeah, right.
and send him one.
Oh, fascinating, fascinating. Well, we'll start to wind down this interview. You had mentioned we'll jump off the military side of things for a little bit. You'd mentioned children and grandchildren. How many children do you have? Grandchildren, great grandchildren?
I've got in sequence a daughter, a son, and a daughter. All doing very nicely. I'm very proud of them, and their families are also doing very well, which is getting into the second generation, which is really a test of more of a test than your own kids, and it makes me very pleased and proud to know they're all doing well, and I've got 10 grandkids and 6 great-grandkids.
Great. Oh, wow.
So, then as all my kids know that I have a hiatal hernia which backfired on me in late February, and spilled gastric acid into my lungs, which burnt them and a lot of scar tissue, which slowly healing, but has required the necessity of this cannula.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Well, like I said, Bob, we'll wind down this interview. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about, or anything, any story or thoughts that have bubbled up since we sat down for this interview that you'd like to talk about? So hopefully we rounded out your story as best we can, or do you think we covered it all?
Well, talking, I'm not thinking, so of other things, but no, this is, I appreciate you doing this. Give a little more history to posterity, I guess,
Absolutely.
my family. And
yeah. Well, the last question I always like to ask in these interviews is, how do you think that period of time, your war years, played a role in your life, affected your life, changed your life at all, or was it simply just a chapter that you went through? How would you answer that?
Well, I think one accepts life just as it goes on, and you take one stage at a time. Looking back, there's a lot of things I could have done differently, and that would have changed the whole sequence. You live with what you do. I feel very fortunate in the times I've lived in. I feel that I used to be a conservative thinker, mainly based on fiscal responsibilities of our government. And so when, I'll say, Ronald Reagan came in, and I couldn't believe to me it was irresponsible attitude toward balancing the budget. The balancing wasn't done. And so I don't have good faith in either one of the parties anymore, but I think the the philosophy has changed, and the big spending has been with the Conservative Party and the responsible party is taking the blame for it. So anyway, I think I've lived in almost the best span of time. I think the world is getting crowded. I think population is going to be our big problem, and our churches don't seem to want to face that. And the water, there's going to be a lot of problems coming from our uncontrolled use of our natural environment. And I guess that's the soapbox I stand on for the most part. That because we haven't faced good controls on our manufacturing processes and our chemistry, and we're putting our very life in jeopardy. And until we find a way of solving that, or I don't know if we can retrace that or not.
Yeah, wow.
But unfortunately, that's what we're leaving our generations following.
Yeah. Well, very good. Well, on that point, I want to, we'll end the interview. I want to thank you for sitting down to tell your story today, but just as important, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you.